What the fuck is wrong with you?
Hands by your back. Hands by your back. I'm here.
You're not listening. I got one already done.
Yep. What's going on? What is this about?
I got a warrant, bro.
You fucking listen to us before someone gets hurt, man. That's how shit goes down.
Warrant.
You getting it, Rick?
Sorry, you got. My bad.
What about my phone? We'll get you one. We'll get you one. We'll grab this stuff. Yep. Just leave this coffee.
Come on, man. Walk.
Well, that's why we wanted to talk to you, to find out if there's any other explanation. But we can't ask you any more questions if you want a lawyer present.
Yeah, I think I should have a lawyer present. I just don't know what to do or say. It doesn't make sense to me, so I don't know. I don't know what to do.
On June 9th, 2024, detectives at Dulles International Airport watched a man drink from a water bottle and throw it in the trash. They swabbed it. The DNA matched evidence from a murder 23 years earlier, evidence found under the victim's fingernails. The victim's daughter had dated him for 5 years. She later told investigators he was always gentle with her. She had no idea. Her name was Leslie Prier. She was 49 years old in May of 2001, one of 8 siblings, married to Carl Prier. Everyone called him Sandy, living in a house on Drummond Avenue in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Chevy Chase sits just outside Washington, D.C., a quiet suburb where the streets are tree-lined and the neighbors know each other's names. If this story matters to you, please hit subscribe. It helps us keep investigating these cases. Leslie spent her free time at the local library. Every week she showed up and sat down across from strangers, immigrants trying to find their English, people who had come to this country without the words yet. She opened the workbook. She pointed to the page. She helped them speak. That was who she was. Her daughter Lauren was 24 in 2001, living her own life, building her own future. The kind of daughter whose mother taught English to strangers on her day off. May 2nd started like any other Wednesday. Leslie had work. She was expected at the office that morning. She didn't show up. Her boss, a man named Brett, waited. Then he called the house. No answer. He called again. Nothing. Something wasn't right. Leslie didn't miss work. She didn't go silent. Brett picked up the phone one more time and called Sandy. Sandy met him at the house. They walked up to the front door together. No sign of forced entry. The lock turned. The door opened. Inside, the foyer looked wrong. The rug was scrunched up against the wall like someone had shoved it there. Furniture overturned, a chair on its side, and blood, spattered in arcs across the wall like something had been swung with force, pooled thick on the hardwood floor near the base of the stairs, smeared in long streaks where something heavy had been dragged. More of it than either man had ever seen outside of a hospital. The air was still. The house was silent. They stood in the doorway and didn't move further inside. Someone called 911. Montgomery County investigators arrived within minutes. They stepped through the front door and immediately understood what they were looking at. This wasn't a burglary interrupted. This was violence, the kind that doesn't stop when it should. They followed the trail. Blood led from the foyer across the hardwood. Droplets at first, then more, then smears where hands or knees had pressed against the floor. The trail turned toward the staircase, up the first step, the second, the third. Investigators climbed slowly, documenting every mark, every spatter, every place where the blood had pooled and then been disturbed again by movement. At the top of the stairs, the trail turned left down the hallway. The master bathroom was at the end. The door was open. The light was off. But even from the hallway, they could see her. Leslie Prier was lying partially inside the shower, face down. Her head had been battered. The floor around her was dark with blood. The walls were streaked where she'd been positioned, or where she'd tried to pull herself up. Investigators stood at the threshold and took in the scene before stepping inside. She had been beaten, strangled. dragged from the foyer where the attack began all the way up the stairs to this bathroom. Someone had done this to her in her own home. Someone who had walked through that front door without breaking it down. They followed the trail of blood up the staircase. At the top, the master bathroom door was open. Leslie was inside. The autopsy came back fast. Leslie Prier died from strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. Multiple strikes. The medical examiner noted that she'd been beaten first, struck repeatedly near the foyer where the overturned furniture was found, then strangled, then dragged up the stairs to the bathroom where her body was left. Years later, during sentencing, the judge would call it a slow death. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in door, no pry marks on the locks. Whoever killed Leslie Prier had walked through the front door without forcing it open. Either Leslie had let her killer inside, or the killer had a key. Montgomery County detectives worked the case like they'd work any murder. They started with the husband. Sandy Prier was asked to take a polygraph test. He agreed. The examiner who ran the test later told investigators that Sandy failed it miserably. He didn't just fail, he graded it as a 100% failure, the kind of result that leaves no room for interpretation. Then a neighbor came forward. She told police that on the morning of May 2nd, Sandy had waved to her from his driveway. Nothing unusual about that, except that Sandy rarely waved. She said it felt deliberate, like he was making sure she saw him, making sure someone clocked that he was there, in plain sight, going about his morning. Sandy hired an attorney. He stopped answering questions. He stopped talking to investigators altogether. In the eyes of the detectives working the case, that silence looked like guilt. In the eyes of the community watching from the outside, it looked worse. Everything pointed to Sandy Prier. The failed polygraph, the deliberate wave, the refusal to cooperate, the fact that there was no forced entry, and Leslie had been killed in her own home by someone who could walk right in. Detectives built their case around him. The husband is always the first suspect, and in this case, the husband looked like the only suspect. But then the DNA came back. Investigators had found male DNA beneath Leslie's fingernails. Skin cells. The kind of evidence left behind when someone fights back and scratches their attacker. It was tested, compared against Sandy's sample. No match. The DNA didn't belong to Sandy Prier. It didn't belong to anyone in the system. It didn't belong to anyone investigators could identify. Detectives ran it through every database they had access to. Nothing. No hits. No leads. No name. Sandy Prier had no scratches on his body. No defensive wounds. No marks that would suggest Leslie had clawed at him during the attack. The physical evidence didn't support the narrative investigators had been building. And just like that, the case stalled. Lauren Prier was 24 years old when her mother was murdered. She'd grown up in that house on Drummond Avenue. She knew every corner of it. She knew her parents' routines. She knew her mother's schedule. And now she was sitting in the wreckage of it all. Her mother gone, her father under suspicion, and no one able to tell her what actually happened or who actually did it. There was no arrest, no charges filed, no public statement clearing Sandy's name. Just an investigation that had stopped moving forward. Just a family trying to bury Leslie while the questions hung over all of them. Just a daughter watching her father live under a cloud of suspicion that wouldn't lift because the case had nowhere else to go. Lauren couldn't fix it. She couldn't make the DNA match someone. She couldn't make the investigators find another suspect. She couldn't make the neighbors stop wondering. She could only watch. The DNA didn't match Sandy Prier. It didn't match anyone. And just like that, the investigation had nowhere left to go. Years went by without an arrest. Detectives followed up on tips when they came in. They re-interviewed witnesses when new questions surfaced. They kept the file active, but there were no new leads, no breakthroughs. The DNA beneath Leslie's fingernails stayed unmatched. The case that had pointed so hard at Sandy Prier and then stopped pointing at anyone became the kind of file that sits in a drawer and doesn't get pulled unless someone specifically asks for it. The family learned to live with the open question. Leslie's daughter Lauren went on with her life because there was no other choice. She graduated. She worked. She built a future in a world where her mother's murder was unsolved, and her father carried the weight of what the community still whispered about. The case didn't close, but it didn't progress either. It just sat there, year after year, unanswered. At the local library where Leslie used to volunteer, the ESL classes kept running. New students came in who had never met her. New volunteers sat at the table where she used to sit. The workbooks were still there. The chairs were still there. Someone else was teaching now. The students still learned their English. But Leslie wasn't coming back. Meanwhile, 3 or 4 months after Leslie's murder, Eugene Gligor moved out of his neighborhood. A neighbor noticed. About 9 months after the murder, that same neighbor called in a tip to Montgomery County Police. She told them Gligor's home had been visited by police multiple times for noise complaints, underage drinking, drug use. She told them the Gligors had moved out not long after Leslie was killed. The tip was logged. Investigators looked at it. Nothing came of it. Eugene Gligor was no stranger to the Prier family. He had dated Lauren in high school. They'd been together for about 5 years, from 1994 to 1997. His name was in the case file from the beginning. He'd been interviewed. He'd said he was out of town during Leslie's memorial service. He was noted. And then the investigation moved on. Gligor built a life in Washington, D.C. He went to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. He made friends. He had jobs. He lived a normal life. At some point, years after the murder, he sat down at a restaurant with Lauren. They caught up. They talked. He smiled. He was the same person she'd always known. Gentle, calm, never violent. She had no idea. The years passed. Sandy Prier got older. The suspicion never lifted. Neighbors on Drummond Avenue didn't forget what the police had implied in those first weeks after Leslie died. They remembered the failed polygraph, the attorney, the silence. Sandy couldn't explain it away because there was nothing to explain. He hadn't done it, but he also couldn't prove who had. He just lived with it. Every conversation, every passing glance at the grocery store, every time someone looked at him a little too long or a little too carefully. The cloud sat over him and wouldn't move. Then he got sick. It was a long illness, the kind that takes years, not months. Sandy declined slowly. His health failed. His strength left him. And through all of it, the case remained unsolved. No one ever came forward to clear his name. No detective ever stood in front of a camera and said they'd moved on from Carl Prier as a suspect. The file stayed open. The DNA stayed unmatched. And Sandy Prier, the man who'd found his wife's body, the man who'd called 911, the man who'd failed a polygraph because grief and shock don't read well on a machine, spent his final years knowing that some people in his community still thought he'd killed her. In 2017, after that long illness, Carl Sandy Prier died. His name was never cleared. No one had ever publicly stated that he wasn't a suspect. No one had ever apologized for what those first few weeks of suspicion had done to his reputation. He just died, and the question of what happened to his wife went with him, still unanswered. Lauren buried her father. She stood at his grave and carried 2 losses now, instead of 1. Her mother murdered. Her father gone without ever hearing the truth about who killed her. There was no resolution, no closure, no answer. Just a daughter standing at a burial, holding a weight that had been there for 16 years and would keep being there because no one had found the person who actually did it. Carl Sandy Prier was buried in 2017. The case that had destroyed the last decade of his life was still open. The man who actually killed his wife was, at that moment, very much alive. and no one was looking for him. If you want to see how this case finally breaks open, please subscribe and hit the like button. The next revelation is coming. Now back to the case. The case sat cold until 2022. In September of that year, Montgomery County detectives Tara Augustine and Allison Dupuy submitted the cold case DNA to Family Tree DNA. The sample had been sitting in evidence for 21 years. The technology to read it had existed for decades. But the technology to compare it against genealogy databases, to trace family lines backward through public records and DNA matches, was newer. And it worked. A match came back. A relative in Romania. A man named Eugene Gligor. The surname was Romanian. The DNA link was clear. Detectives started building a family tree. They worked backward from Eugene Gligor in Romania to relatives who had immigrated to the United States. Birth records, marriage certificates, immigration documents, census data, each branch of the tree leading them closer to someone in the Washington, D.C. area. And one name surfaced on that tree that was already in the 2001 case file. Eugene Gligor, Romanian ancestry, Leslie Prier's ex-boyfriend. They'd dated for about 5 years, from 1994 to 1997. He'd been interviewed right after the murder. He'd said he was out of town during Leslie's memorial service. His name had been noted. And then the investigation had moved on. And while detectives were doing all of this, while Sandy Prier's family was learning to live without him, while Lauren was carrying 2 losses instead of 1, Eugene Gligor was attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. His friends would later stand in a courtroom and call him a kind person. Detectives pulled Gligor's background: weapons possession, DUI, theft. He'd been listed as a suspect in residential burglaries. Nothing had stuck. Nothing had led to serious charges. But the pattern was there. And then investigators found something else. Gligor's brother had pet sat for the Priers. He'd been in their house. He'd had access. Detectives theorized that Eugene may have copied a set of keys, may have let himself in on May 2nd, 2001, expecting no one to be home. May have panicked when Leslie was there. They needed a DNA sample to confirm the match. But they couldn't just ask for one. If Gligor knew he was being investigated, he could disappear. He could lawyer up. He could destroy evidence. Detectives needed his DNA without him knowing they were looking for it. On June 9, 2024, Eugene Gligor landed at Dulles International Airport after an international trip. Officers were waiting. They pulled him aside for what they called a special screening. Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about. Just a few routine questions. Customs and Border Protection officers sat him down. They asked where he'd been, how long he'd stayed, what the purpose of the trip was. Normal questions. Questions thousands of travelers get asked every day. While they talked, they offered him water. Gligor took the bottle. He opened it. He drank. He answered their questions calmly. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't suspicious. Why would he be? It was just a screening, just a conversation. When the questions were done, he stood up. He threw the empty water bottle in the trash. He walked out of the airport and went home. Detectives retrieved the bottle from the trash. They swabbed the rim. They submitted the sample to the lab. The DNA on that water bottle was a perfect match to the DNA found beneath Leslie Prier's fingernails 23 years earlier. Gligor's attorneys would later argue that the airport sting violated his Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure. They'd file motions. They'd challenge the evidence. They'd say the screening wasn't related to legitimate border security and that everything collected from it should be thrown out. That legal question would never be answered by a judge. 9 days later, on June 18, 2024, surveillance teams set up outside Eugene Gligor's apartment in Washington, D.C. They waited. Hours passed. The afternoon stretched on. Normal people walked by. Cars drove past. Nothing unusual. Just another June day in the city. Then Gligor came outside. He was wearing a black t-shirt and jeans. He walked down the front steps of his building and sat down. Just sitting there, not going anywhere, not in a hurry, not looking around. Just a man on his front steps on a Tuesday afternoon. Officers moved in. Multiple officers in plainclothes approached from different angles. They identified themselves. Gligor stood up. His hands went up slightly, palms open. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He just stood there, on the stairs, while officers moved him against the railing and cuffed his hands behind his back. The whole thing was over in seconds. Quiet. Controlled. Almost anticlimactic for an arrest 23 years in the making. Eugene Gligor came outside, walked down to the front of his building, and sat down on the stairs. He had no idea anyone was watching. He'd had no idea for 23 years. They brought Eugene Gligor to a D.C. police station after the arrest. He was held in a locked room for 2 hours. Someone gave him a bologna sandwich. Then Detectives Tara Augustine and Allison Dupuy walked in and sat down across from him. Augustine read him his rights. The right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. Gligor said he understood. Then she started asking questions. She brought up the 2001 case in Chevy Chase. She asked if he recalled Leslie Prier. Yes, Gligor said. That she was murdered. They talked about him dating Lauren, about hanging out at the Prier house, about how he'd learned of Leslie's death. From Lauren, he said. The conversation stayed calm, polite even. Then the detectives brought up the DNA. They told him his DNA had been found at the crime scene. Gligor shifted. He said he didn't have any recollection of being involved with any of it. He didn't know. He didn't remember. Over and over the same words. I don't know. I don't remember. He sat there, hands clasped, trying to stay composed. At one point, the detectives noted that he wasn't crying, wasn't showing emotion. There's no tears coming out of your face, one of them said. Gligor tried to explain. He said he was very dry, parched, dehydrated. The conversation continued. The pressure built. Gligor shifted in his seat. I feel a little bit trapped, he said. Detective Augustine didn't hesitate. Well, you're under arrest. You should feel trapped. Gligor asked for an attorney. The interview ended. On May 8th, 2025, just days after the 24th anniversary of Leslie Prier's death, Eugene Gligor pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Prosecutors acknowledged there was no evidence of premeditation, no proof he'd planned to kill her. Just the fact that he had. 3 months later, on August 28, 2025, more than 60 people filled the courtroom at the Montgomery County Circuit Courthouse in Rockville, Maryland. 7 members of Leslie's family stood one by one and read impact statements. They spoke directly to the judge. They spoke about Leslie, about what her loss had cost them, about the 23 years they'd spent without answers, about Sandy dying under suspicion, about the weight of it all. Then Lauren Prier stood up. She had been 24 years old when her mother was murdered. She had dated Eugene Gligor for 5 years. From the time she was 15 until she was 20, he'd been part of her life. He'd sat at their dinner table. He'd spent holidays with them. He'd been in her home, in her family, in her world. And the entire time, he'd already done it. He'd already killed her mother and walked away. And she had no idea. For 23 years, she'd carried her mother's unsolved murder. For 23 years, she'd watched her father live under suspicion. For 16 of those years, she'd stood at her father's grave, knowing he'd died without ever being cleared. And now she was standing in a courtroom, looking at the man who'd caused all of it, the man she'd once trusted, the man she'd once cared about. She looked directly at Eugene Gligor and called him a wolf in sheep's clothing. The prosecution presented crime scene photographs, images of the foyer, the blood, the bathroom where Leslie's body was found. Lauren cried out when the photos appeared on the screen. The courtroom went silent. Gligor was given a chance to speak. He stood. He was tearful. He addressed the court. He said he'd been using cocaine and drinking heavily at the time of the murder. He claimed he experienced blackouts. He said he vaguely remembered leaving the Prier house that morning, but the rest was a blur. He said he knew Lauren and her family wanted to know why he was there and what happened, but he couldn't give them an answer. He said he was sorry. Then he said something else. Leslie always was very kind to me. Leslie's brother, Bill, spoke afterward. He called Gligor's words empty and impossible to believe. Judge David Lease sentenced Eugene Gligor to 30 years in prison, with all but 22 years suspended. He would serve 22 years, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. And then, officially, finally, on the record, Sandy Prier's name was cleared. The case that had destroyed the last years of his life was closed. The man who killed his wife had been identified, arrested, and convicted. It came too late for Sandy, but it came. Lauren walked out of that courtroom carrying something she hadn't had in 23 years. Not closure, not peace, but an answer. Leslie Prier was 49 years old. Every week, she drove to the local library and sat down across from strangers who didn't have the words yet. She always showed up.